live from Mitchell Hall at the University of Delaware. This is Delaware Debates.
Good evening. I'm Nancy Karibjanian. On behalf of Delaware Public Media, WDDE 91.1 FM, and the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication, welcome to Delaware Debates 2014, made possible with the financial support of the William P. Frank Foundation of Delaware and the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. Joining me to co-moderate is Jason Mycoff, University of Delaware Professor of Political Science and International Relations. Now, our first debate among the candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives included Republican Rose Izzo and Democrat John Carney. But after committing to participate in tonight's debate, the Republican candidate withdrew just 2 weeks ago. Regrettably, Ms. Izzo's seat at the debate remains empty tonight. Democrat John Carney, the incumbent in the race, is here to answer both moderator and student questions. Mr. Carney, welcome.
Great to be with you.
Tonight's debate is actually divided into two parts. Following a 2-minute opening statement from Mr. Carney, Jason Mycoff and I will be posing questions to the candidate. Responses are limited to 3 minutes, with the opportunity for moderators to ask follow-ups after 2 minutes. The total time spent discussing a single topic, including the moderated discussion, cannot exceed 5 minutes. We will then turn to student questions from the students from the University of Delaware and Delaware State University, and responses here will be limited to 2 minutes. Mr. Carney will also have 2 minutes for a closing statement. Now, there's one more rule. Our live audience here in Mitchell Hall on the University of Delaware Newark campus understands that there will be no applause during tonight's debate. We will now begin, and to do so, we turn to John Carney for an opening statement.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the University of Delaware, Delaware State University, and Delaware First Media for hosting this debate, and all the people for coming. It's always good to be back here on campus at the University of Delaware. I came here in 1981 to coach football under legendary coach Tubby Raymond while pursuing a master's degree in public administration. I had a lot of fun coaching those teams, and I'm still a big Blue Hens fan to this day. But it was here in the College of Urban Affairs and Public Policy, and in particular the Legislative Fellows Program, that I was first inspired to do the work that I'm doing today in government and politics. I came here to coach and to compete on the gridiron, and I left with the inspiration to serve the people of Delaware and to make a difference in our state. I'm delighted to see that the MPA program continues to inspire and prepare young students for careers in public service today. I told Delawareans when I was first elected that I would go to Congress to work on the serious challenges facing the country, and that's exactly what I've tried to do. I've worked across the aisle to help expand and protect the middle class, to preserve the kinds of opportunities that I had growing up here in Delaware. I've worked to make college more affordable so students like the ones here can get a good education and training that they're going to need to get good jobs after graduation. I'm working to preserve the 30-year fixed mortgage so when these students want to buy their first home, they can get the financing to do that. And I'm working to support the resurgence of U.S. manufacturing so parents like the ones that I knew growing up could get the opportunities that those good jobs provide. When I went to Congress, I promised to take the Delaware way with me. It's been hard, but I've tried to do it every day. And today, more than ever, we need more members working across the aisle to get things done.
Let's get down to the issues then, as we have concluded your opening statement, and we're going to pull into some of the things that you just spoke of, and specifically jobs and business in Delaware. The landscape of manufacturing in the U.S. is changing. There's an interesting take on these changes that the manufacturing job sector is the fragility of the global supply chain and that it is just stretched way too thin. The result being that there is an advantage in producing goods closer to home. Your focus on manufacturing includes the voluntary labeling program for American-made goods, the America Star program. But what can be done to entice producers to locate in the U.S. and possibly locate in Delaware?
Well, I think we're on the verge of a real comeback for U.S. manufacturing. And the thing that keeps me up at night is what are we going to do, kind of as I alluded to in my opening statement, what are we going to do to expand and protect the middle class? The problem we have is we have an incredible income divide where we have a lot of jobs at the low end of the spectrum that pay minimum wage and a little bit more. We have a lot of jobs that require a lot of education and highly technical skills. But the center has been, the middle, if you will, has been hollowed out. We have a real opportunity, I think now, with cheaper, more available energy in our country, with the opportunity, as you say, to establish supply chains here in the US, and we're seeing a resurgence. General Electric has moved jobs, appliance manufacturing from Mexico back to Indiana and Ohio and some of those states in the Middle West. Apple has moved a big fabrication facility into the Southwest, and Tesla is building their batteries now in the state of Nevada. We have to, at the federal level, we have to get the big things right, if you will. Tax policy, a fiscal plan, all those kinds of incentives that make it possible for businesses to do well here in the United States, to set up an operation and manufacture goods right here. We have another challenge, though, and that is that there's a big disconnect between the skills that are demanded by advanced manufacturing facilities and the skills that some of our young people have in the workforce. We see that in the job fairs that the delegation has been doing up and down our state. And that's something that we have to invest in and we have to focus on.
Well, we'll get to education in a bit, but I have a follow-up for you. How far do you think the government, even individual states, should go to entice employers? Delaware did a lot to get AstraZeneca, and that has not panned out. We have a beautiful park, but it is now with JP Morgan moving in, but it is clearly not what the original intention ever was. Is there lessons to be learned from this to move forward?
So the main focus at the federal level should be getting the big things right, as I said a minute ago. We need to reform our tax code. Just recently in the state of Delaware, we were at risk of losing 2,000 jobs at AstraZeneca because Pfizer wanted to buy AstraZeneca and then re-domicile overseas because Great Britain has a much lower corporate income tax than we do in the United States. At 35% at the margin, that's one of the highest in the world, and it's really costing us jobs and creating an incentive for businesses to move overseas, reestablish their headquarters.
So now that we're in moderated discussion, in the follow-up
So we're going to go back and forth now?
So yes, do you feel then that it doesn't matter who owns the company? Fisker's now owned by a Chinese company.
Well, I think that we can take advantage of foreign companies that want to invest here in the U.S., then we need to grow our own. I think it's all of the above, if you will. We have to set the conditions. We have to get the regulatory environment right. We have to get the tax policy right. And right now, our corporate income tax and our tax policy generally, it's too complicated, has the wrong incentives, and at the corporate level, it's a really negative incentive for companies doing business here in the U.S.
You've been mentioning incentives to businesses to move to a state, establish manufacturing facilities.
No, I'm talking about getting the big things right at the federal level. The state role is a little bit different, where they have a strategic fund and they make investments, if you will, available for companies. Federal government doesn't do a lot of that. We do have programs where we provide tax incentives that businesses, particularly in clean energy technologies, that kind of thing, can take advantage of a certain tax preference, which makes it better for them to set up here in Delaware and in this country. But we don't do at the federal level the kinds of incentives I think that you're talking about.
So
Jason, if you could, we should move on to our next topic.
Yeah.
We've hit that 5-minute level on this, and I think you're taking charge of this next issue.
Yes, so on the issue of income inequality has become a hot topic in the national political discussion. You mentioned it earlier. The Washington Post reported in September that Delaware was one of 15 states to see income inequality rise in the last year. Is income inequality a serious problem? Should Congress be working on solutions to reduce income inequality?
It's a big problem, and here's why. And it's something I think about as I travel back and forth to Washington on the train a lot. The one thing that's special about America is the opportunity to work hard, get a good education, and work yourself into a job to put you into the middle class, and do the same for your kids. Generations of people have come to our country and are coming to our country today for just that opportunity. And if all of a sudden we're saying we've got a barbell income strata where we got a lot of people, a lot of jobs at the lower end and a lot of jobs at the upper end that require high level of skills and education and not a lot in the middle, that opportunity society starts to go away. So it makes a big difference. And that's one of the things that holds the country together. People in different states and income groups, the idea that everybody has an opportunity to get ahead. And so we got to go back to where we started off with your question about what do you do about that? And the answer partly has to be, first of all, our students have to be well educated. They have to have the skills necessary to compete globally for these jobs. And we have to allow our manufacturers to bring back manufacturing so that somebody who's not going to go to college and get an advanced degree can get make a good income at some of these middle-level jobs.
Focusing on the lower end of the income inequality scale.
So we should raise the minimum wage. I'm a sponsor of the bill. Somebody that goes to work every day shouldn't have to live in poverty.
Well, let me ask you about the minimum wage then. So if you're a proponent of raising the minimum wage, a Congressional Budget Office report found that raising the minimum wage could negatively affect unemployment, right? It could drive unemployment.
I think that's exactly right.
Do you think that's a big concern?
It's a trade-off that we have to consider, and it's a trade-off that I'm willing to make sure that people who go to work, who work hard every day, get the minimum wage at $10.10, not even a livable wage.
So what is your target?
Well, $10.10 would be a good start, and that's the bill that I'm a co-sponsor on, and that's basically what I support. The state has gone up. The federal minimum wage now is, I think, $8.25 or whatever, just moving up from $7.75 to $8.25. $10.10, I think, is a good target. It's not going to come up for a vote in the House anytime soon, but it's something that I support.
What do you think is going to happen to America's middle class?
We got to bring it back. To me, it's one of the most important challenges that we face as a country. And I know that business leaders across the country are thinking about it. I've met with them, and they're starting. Jeff Immelt, who's the CEO of General Electric, happens to be a good friend of mine. We played college football together. And he has intentionally moved some of this appliance manufacturing back to some of those states in the Midwest. Now, they were having quality problems down in Mexico, so there are reasons for that. And they also came up through lean manufacturing techniques with ways to produce a unit in a fraction of the time that it was taking them down at Mexico. So there are reasons in terms of productivity. But if you think about the productivity gains that have happened over the last decade or 2 decades, workers have not shared in those gains in terms of wages. And that's a really important factor. And the important part is just the belief that if you go to work every day and you work hard, that you won't live in poverty and that you'll be able to raise a middle-class family.
Let's move on then. This is a big topic. What is the biggest national security threat facing the U.S. today, and what would you say is the best way to tackle that issue?
That is a difficult question because we have so many problems internationally, but clearly, to me, they're all related from the perspective of the threat of global terrorism on the United States. And when we had the vote before we broke for the election to give the president the authority to equip and train moderate Syrian rebels to fight ISIS, I was very uncomfortable with that vote because I was not at all confident that we had reliable partners on the ground, either in Iraq, which has a government that we help support, or in Syria, less so in Syria. If you remember, a year or two ago, there was a lot of clamoring to arm rebels, and the president was hesitant to do that. I think rightly so, because those rebels now became ISIS. Other countries in the region didn't hesitate. And they provided arms and they provided resources and created a monster. We can either fight those fights in Syria, in Iraq, or we'll be fighting at the borders here in the US. They have thousands of foreign fighters with foreign passports who could more easily get into the United States. There's not a lot of evidence that people are doing that right now, but that's the greatest fear and the greatest threat to the U.S., in my opinion.
And we can move into moderated discussion on this topic.
So when you said you were concerned about giving the president the authority to get involved in Syria, expanding our Middle East presence, are you confident that the president's following the best course of action in Syria today?
It's the best of a lot of bad options, I think. And the reason is because it's difficult to determine who the reliable partners are going to be in both Iraq and in Syria. I think we have a new regime in Iraq that provides some possibility there. And remember that the objectives, to a certain extent, are at cross purposes. We are trying to support rebels to take out Assad. That's what ISIS is trying to do. And so we're going to arm and equip another group of moderate rebels who are going to both fight ISIS and fight Assad. That strikes me as a very difficult thing to accomplish. On the other hand, for me, the do nothing option just didn't feel like an option. For me to fulfill my responsibility to the people that I represent here in the state of Delaware, because I felt like if we didn't stop them there in Syria and Iraq, that we would have to deal with them somewhere else closer to our own shores.
Let me ask you about another topic in national security, and it might be something where it was almost a do-nothing policy that's led us to where we are now, and that is Ebola. The president today met with, to get the most updated information, 2 healthcare workers have contracted Ebola as of this morning. Are we now at a point of just simply trying to contain this rather than combat it?
Well, it's very distressing to see what has developed both in West Africa as well as the 2 cases now here in the US. And I think there are 2 things that we have to do. One is to set up treatment centers, as the US Army is currently doing in the West African countries, to fight it there. And also at the airports there to make sure that there's screening so people that are infected with the virus don't leave the country and take it somewhere else. The president has announced similar kinds of screening at 5 airports, I think it is, that deal with 90-some% of the people that come from West Africa. So we've got to try to stop them in the West African countries and then stop them at our borders. What's troubling to me is that everybody seems to agree, all the experts seem to agree. There's a stop sign I'm seeing.
Yeah, you can finish your thought though.
Seem to agree with what the right protocols are, but we don't seem to have trained the healthcare professionals to those protocols, and obviously there's been some missteps.
Jason, if you would take us to the next topic.
Moving to social issues. According to a University of Delaware Center for Political Communication poll released today, more than half of Delaware's residents support the legalization of marijuana. That's 56% of those who support full legalization, not for medical purposes only. States around the country, Colorado, Washington, have legalized marijuana already. Other states are in the process of considering legalization. Do you support the full legalization of marijuana in Delaware,
I don't
or why or why not?
I'm hesitant to support full legalization, and I'll tell you why. First of all, we have 2 states right now, Colorado and the state of Washington. I have colleagues who represent districts in those states, and we're learning right now what the implications might be in both of those states for legalizing. I don't think I have what worries me about legalization is unintended consequences. We know, we're seeing right now in our state an epidemic of heroin use and abuse, terrorizing people's lives, killing young people. And I kind of believe, based on kind of life experiences, that these things are kind of gateways, one thing to another. We hear that with respect to people who get addicted to painkillers and then move on to heroin. And that worries me. And so before jumping into that, notwithstanding the support that seems to be out there in the public, I would watch the experience of Colorado and the state of Washington. Now, that's a different proposition than decriminalizing it. You know, you can decriminalize it without making it legal, and I think that's maybe a first step before you went to full legalization. We have, as you say, medical marijuana, you know, general support for that. I think it's been a little slow in getting stood up, but obviously that'll happen over the next year or so as well.
So I'd like clarification on your notion of decriminalizing marijuana. So you're talking about the federal level.
Basically,
at the federal level, decriminalizing?
No. This is a state issue.
Okay.
I mean, it's in some ways an odd question to ask a member of Congress or a member of the Senate, because fundamentally I think it's an issue for the states to deal with. But no, I'm talking about whether you have full legalization where you're selling it in shops and you have, as Colorado does, you have people coming in and buses to take advantage of the new status, or whether you just, it's still not legal, but you don't have a big criminal offense for it and you don't prosecute it in some ways. And my understanding is there's a piece of legislation in the Delaware General Assembly which was intended to do just that, to decriminalize. I mean, there's been a long-standing debate about whether to legalize drugs in our country as a way of preventing taking the money out of it, to prevent the kind of violence that we see that's terrorizing street corners in the city of Wilmington and cities and towns across our region and across the country.
There's not a lot of time to explore this, but I have to ask, do you see Wilmington's crime problem as a drug problem, or is it a gun problem?
Well, I think it's a threefold problem. It's a drug problem, it's a gun problem, and it's a social problem. When you have children, they're coming up. Remember, I live in the city of Wilmington, right by Warner School. Warner School is one of the schools that was identified as a failing school, and it's going to be subject to the actions of the state. And I used to mentor kids in that, and I know that the lack of academic success that those kids have in that school, and when they do, when they are not successful and they're not able to graduate from high school, 50% of the kids in the city of Wilmington don't graduate from high school. If you can't get to that point in the economy we live in today, you don't have many opportunities. And so, to me, it's three things, and it's not a short-term issue to resolve.
Or it could have a short answer, but thank you for the transition to education. In Delaware, the
was
priority...
not intentional, I can
but
guarantee you.
it is very appreciated, thank you. The priority school plan has those 6 Wilmington schools on the bubble, facing what some feel could be a state takeover or else close. The governor was on this campus just this week saying, though, we have to go with what we know works, and this is the way to do it. And we have a closed charter school, Penn Cater. The Reach Academy is on the edge, and also Moyer Academy is about to close. What does this say, if all of this is happening, about those education reform initiatives that have been applied in our state and in other states across the country to this point?
Well, it says something about a problem that we don't like to talk about much, but that it's a real issue and it's not a new issue. And that's something called the achievement gap, and if you have an achievement gap, it becomes an opportunity gap, and we talked about it a minute ago with respect to the effects on the violence in the city of Wilmington. This is not just an issue for Warner Elementary School and Stubbs and some of the schools that are involved in that Priority Schools project. This is an issue in just about every school in our state, and different schools and school districts are more successful at narrowing that achievement gap. When I was lieutenant governor, we had a program that was called Models of Excellence in Education. And the idea was, we know what works. And we went around to the schools to identify programs and schools that worked and teachers and principals that were making it work. And this is not something that's going to happen overnight, and it's certainly not something that's going to be imposed from on high into these individual schools. It's something that has to happen on a collaborative basis with principals and parents and teachers and local communities, figuring out what it takes to educate these children. One of the things that I think is important, we're asking a lot of teachers. We ought to give them the resources that they need, particularly in these high poverty schools, to reach these children. There's been a lot of talk about weighted student funding. I think it's an idea that we need to really take a look at, because that's a systematic way of dealing with the problem, not just in these 6 schools, but in every school that has a high poverty population.
When you look at the record, though, back when you're talking about model schools, Warner Elementary was one of those exceptional elementary schools in our state. And so after a new federal program comes in, model school goes out, and schools that were once considered exemplary were considered on the bubble.
And that's why you have to stick to your knitting. You have to stick to what you know works. It can't be the next best thing that comes down the
But isn't
pike.
that what priority schools is, the
Well,
next best
We
thing?
can let somebody else make a judgment about that. What I'm saying, it's more of a systemic problem than it is for just these individual schools. By the way, it's unacceptable to have schools that are failing like these schools appear to be in terms of their test scores, and some of the charters have been allowed to, whose charters have been revoked. But the idea of saying, okay, our solution to this problem is we're gonna charterize this school. And we've seen from some of the examples of lack of success in some of the charters that are dealing with these student population that might not necessarily be the right answer. What I know is the right answer is more likely to come from within that, from the ground level up, as opposed to the other way. And that's why I don't think that we ought to be imposing those kinds of things from the federal level on down. I'm sure that's a whole subject for a different question and maybe a different day.
Do you have a follow-up on education?
Yeah, I'm wondering, so you were talking about ground-up programs. So Dickinson High School recently started offering an IB curriculum. William Penn offers the opportunity for students to enroll in college classes at the same time they're taking high school classes. How do you think you, in particular, Congress in general, can support this kind of ground-up development of programs?
Well,
And I need to ask you to be quick.
Well, the thing that Congress does and should do is to provide differential funding for disadvantaged populations and for students with disabilities. And we do it well, and that's an appropriate role, and we should do it better. And anybody who has a disabled child will tell you that there's more that can be done today.
Jason, you can take us to our next topic.
All right, our next topic. This year, several high-profile issues, comprehensive immigration reform, were put on the back burner due to gridlock and partisanship in Congress. Can you provide an example of how you have voted independently of your party, putting Delawarean interests before party solidarity?
Funny you should ask. I have a perfect example.
I'd like to hear it.
In one of the more difficult issues that we've been dealing with. In my side of the Capitol, the House of Representatives, we have voted 40 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. We have an issue right here in our state that involves a company called Cigna that has 500 employees on the state line near where I grew up in Claymont. They're going to move to overseas if we're not able to carve out a very narrowly drawn exemption from the Affordable Care Act to what they actually do. What do? They write health insurance plans into the international, the so-called expatriate market. So these are people that maybe work for the DuPont company or other companies, and they go to work overseas in Brazil or Europe for a period of time. And they get these health insurance plans that provide provider networks in foreign countries, reimbursements in multiple currencies. They're very high-end kind of products. It also includes inbound non-citizens who are working here in the US, a lot of them as computer science professionals, same kind of thing. So here we had a piece of legislation narrowly drawn to exempt companies and plans, not companies, but plans that are like this because their competition is from foreign companies who aren't subject to the Affordable Care Act. There was broad agreement, Democrats, Republicans in the White House, particularly about the outgoing Americans going overseas to do this work. Very difficult, very different on the other side where you had non-citizens coming to the US to do this work because not only did it implicate the Affordable Care Act, but it implicated immigration law and reform. And so we worked through that. I could take a long time to explain it. It passed in the House with 260 votes, about 60 of which were Democrats, which I worked to deliver to try to save 500 jobs in our state. We're working to get that piece of legislation passed in the Senate, and hopefully we'll be able to get that done.
And you can
in
continue the
lame day.
discussion on this point.
When you're thinking about this, you're thinking about the party pressure, you're thinking about, should I be voting with the party? What's going through your mind? What are you thinking about when you cast that kind of vote, personally?
Well, I said to myself when I was first elected, and I told the people of our state when I was first elected, that I would go to Washington and I would try to do the right thing for the state of Delaware and for the United States. And that's what I've tried to do. and sometimes oftentimes just for political reasons, that runs counter to what your party might want you to do. Let me give you another example. When the Republicans wanted to shut down the government, however many months ago that was, about 20 Democrats and 20 Republicans started meeting informally to say, this is a stupid thing to do. We should try to stop it. And I got to tell you that both of us, Democrats and Republicans, caught a lot of grief from our leadership on both sides because of what we were doing. On the Republican side, well, they can speak for themselves. On the Democratic side, it was because our leadership thought we were winning because the public didn't want this to happen. That didn't look like a win to me. My constituents weren't winning, and so I wasn't going to go along with it. There are other examples that I could give you, but I don't think I have time.
Well, I have time for just one quick question and to cap this off, and you led us toward it a little bit. Do you feel that you have fulfilled your campaign promises to the people of Delaware for your prior terms?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm frustrated because I don't think we as a Congress have done the work of the people, and I'm part of that, and that doesn't make me feel very good. I have fulfilled the basic promises I made to the people of Delaware, which was basically to be straight with them. Tell them straight, try to do the right thing, and go to Washington every day with that in mind. That's what I promised to do. We haven't been very effective in doing that as a body, and I can tell you that's a source of great frustration for me.
All right. You can take a breath. We're going to move on to questions from the students from the University of Delaware and from Delaware State University. And remember, your responses in this portion will be limited to 2 minutes. Our first question comes from Tori Parker, a senior political science major from Delaware State University.
How satisfied are you with the productivity of Congress, and how can you improve it?
Thank you, Tori. Go Hornets. I am not satisfied at all. Obviously, as you might tell from the last my answer to the last question, there are a lot of really big issues that we've not gotten done. We do not have a fiscal plan for the country. Look, I'm a finance guy. I was the Secretary of Finance for this state. The basic government function is to come up with a budget in the state level that balances, that funds various priorities, and that works. At the federal level, we don't have that. We have a continuing resolution, which essentially is kicking the can constantly down the road. We do now have a 2-year continuing resolution, which is better than what we had before because it gives us and gives agencies some predictability for a period of time. But we really need to deal with some of the unfunded liabilities in our budget, out-year liabilities, and we need to start to stabilize our federal deficits and start to bring the federal debt down, which right now is at $17 trillion, is about 90% or more of GDP, a perilously high amount. Very frustrated, Tori, with our inability to get that done.
All right, we now turn to the issue of America's foreign policy. This question is coming from Darrell Gray, a graduate student and finance major at Delaware State University.
How big of a role should America play in sustaining global peace?
Well, the United States is still the most powerful country in the world, and we ought to be a source of good all the way around the world. And I think it's something that rallies the people in our country. It's something that's important for the security of us at home. If we don't take care of conflicts overseas, whether it's in Syria, Iraq, North Africa, all these regions around the world, in Europe, working with our NATO partners and others, then we're going to deal with serious consequences here at home. And we talked about global terrorism earlier. If you think about the fact that we live in a global economy now, in a very small world, having the kinds of relationships among countries is so important to our success as a nation and to the success of the rest of the world.
I believe we have time for a follow-up.
Yeah, so when you are talking about keeping peace in the world, you've said during the campaign that we shouldn't be building bridges and roads in Afghanistan, for example. We should be building them here. Should we be out of the business of nation building? Is that part of maintaining the peace?
You know, it might sound a little bit at odds with what I just said, but in Afghanistan in particular, and I know this because I visited there in my first term, and I saw the lack of a civil society, the lack of a functioning government, the corruption, and all of the reports that I was seeing was that it was just pouring good money after bad. That doesn't mean, I also took a trip over Labor Day to Central America to find out what was happening behind these young kids that were coming to our southern border. And there's an opportunity closer to home where we should actually be making investments in that those countries and in their economies to keep those kids and their parents from coming north, from having to come to north. The poverty there is staggering. And obviously we've spent billions of dollars through the 80s fighting civil wars down there. We ought to be investing in their economies, and that'll have lots of positive effects on the U.S., in my opinion.
Well, let's move on to a question concerning research spending, and it comes from Kelly Daniels, a junior biochemistry major at the University of Delaware.
The area of research and development has experienced significant funding cuts over the recent years. How do you value research in our society, and what are your plans to make this area a spending priority?
So if we're going to compete globally and outcompete other nations around the world, we've got to have the best research capabilities of other countries around the world. That will enable us to build manufacturing and supply chains here in the U.S. And part of that, a lot of that basic research, most of that basic research comes with federal funding. Some of that has been capped with the sequestration mechanism that imposed spending caps across the board on the domestic side and the defense side. And that accentuates the need to have a fiscal plan. Because if you have a fiscal plan that makes investments in basic economic infrastructure, in research and development, in jobs and industries of the future, then you're going to get a return on that investment, as opposed to making investments in programs that are somewhat obsolete, they're not effective. And by the way, one of the biggest areas that we need to work on to get our fiscal house in order is to reduce the increasing cost of healthcare across our society.
We're going to move on to our next student question. This comes from the University of Delaware's Cecilia Teft, a junior finance and anthropology double major. This question concerns climate change.
In light of the recent UN summit on climate change, what are some immediate feasible actions that Delaware can take to reduce our impact on the environment?
Well, first of all, I go to work every day in a body where more than half of the members don't believe, or at least don't publicly admit that they believe in the climate change science. In fact, we have voted on legislation, on amendments to EPA and other funding bills that basically said that the EPA cannot use any of these appropriated funds for the purpose of climate change science. We're not that way here in the state of Delaware, and the state has set up committees to look at the effects of sea rise on our coastal areas. We are a low-lying state. If there's a state that's going to be negatively impacted by climate change and sea rise, the state of Delaware is one of them. And there are a lot of things that we need to do to address that issue, and I know they're doing that at the state level.
Well, it's time for the closing statement at this point. So we want to thank you for fielding both our questions and also those from the students from the two universities. You now have 2 minutes for this closing statement.
Well, let me just end by thanking the University of Delaware, Delaware State University, again, Delaware First Media, and both of you for these rapid-fire questions. I've never quite debated myself before. I'm not sure how I will. Although I do debate myself on a regular basis since I'm the only member of our delegation in the House side. We have some really serious issues to address as a Congress, and we're not doing it. We need a fiscal plan. We need tax reform. We need to make investments in infrastructure and in research and development. We need to support the reemergence of U.S. manufacturing. We need to rebuild the middle class. And we can only do that. This is hard stuff to do. We can only do that if we work together. That's what I've tried to do as Delaware's lone member of the House of Representatives. When we go up to vote, there's a guy in the Capitol, I'm not sure exactly where he works, but he has a connection with Walter Reed. And he brings these wounded veterans to the door of the Capitol as we go in there. And invariably, they've lost an arm or a leg or an arm and a leg. And they're there to thank us for our service. We should thank them. And we should thank them and honor their service and their sacrifice by going into the chamber and doing the right thing for the country. That's what I try to do when I go to Washington. And if the good people of Delaware vote for me on November the 4th, I'll be doing that for another 2 years. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And that does wrap up this portion of this evening. We thank you very much, Mr. Carney. We're going to take a brief intermission, and then we will begin a debate in the race for the U.S. Senate. That begins at 8 o'clock.
Delaware Debates is a joint initiative of the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication and WDDE 91.1 FM, Delaware Public Media, with support from American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network and the William P. Frank Foundation of Delaware.